Today's story acknowledges that just because the people of God had escaped slavery in Egypt didn't make life easy. It was tough wandering in the wilderness, not just because they were in a desert, but because they didn't really know how to act. I mean, think about it. All their lives as slaves, they had someone always telling them what to do, what they could and couldn't do. They'd never been free before, never had to think for themselves. And what they were finding was that as they wandered in the wilderness, it wasn't going well. And so God brought them to Mount Sinai, this place where Moses had encountered the burning bush. And God brought a cloud down over the mountain, and Moses went up to speak with God. And there, God dictated the covenant onto stone. But it took a long time. And meanwhile, the people down at the base of the mountain, they were starting to get restless. They began to wonder if they had been abandoned by Moses, if they had been abandoned by God. What if they died? And their restlessness, they began to take their gold earrings and bracelets, these things they had taken from the Egyptians, and they cast them into this massive golden calf, this sign of fertility and life and hope. And you have to understand, this was kind of an appealing thing to do, because if you make your own God, you get to decide the rules. Or you get to have no rules at all, which is pretty much what the Hebrew people chose, and they ran wild. Meanwhile, up above on the mountain, God saw all that was happening, and God began to fume. God was angry how quickly the people had given up on God, and the heat of God's nostrils was not far from consuming them. And so Moses had to talk God down. Once Moses got God to promise not to just obliterate the people and start over with Moses, he went to deal with them. The Moses himself got rather angry when he saw everything that was happening. He broke those tablets that he and God had been working on. And then he ground up the golden calf into this fine powder and mixed it with water and made those people drink their sin. They had the sons of Levi clean house. After getting things back under control, Moses went back up the mountain, asked and pleaded to God for forgiveness for himself and for all of the people. And as you know, God loves people. God loved them so much, and that forgiveness was given. God made new tablets. God wrote down the covenant on that stone. There were 3 commandments as part of this, 3 about God. The first was to be faithful to God, as God had been faithful to the people, that nothing should be more important than that. God didn't want people to use the divine name to curse or condemn one another. And God also wanted the people to observe a Sabbath, because they had worked 7 days a week when they were back in slaves in Egypt, and God knew that they needed to take a break so that they could enjoy creation the way that God did on that 7th day of creation. And then God gave another 7 commands that had to do with relationships, things like honor your parents because they have some wisdom to share, and it will make your days long in the land that God is giving them. God reminding them not to murder and steal from one another. These are the basics of community. God said to be faithful in all relationships and not to slander and lie and cheat. And God taught them not to be jealous of one another, jealous not just of property, but of other people's relationships, but instead to be satisfied with what we already have. But there were more than those 10 commandments on those tablets. I know it's hard to believe. It was written on front and back. This whole covenant, this whole promise of God. There were words like that God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. It did say things like that God will punish the sins of the parents on their children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generations, but there will be forgiveness and love to the 1,000th generation. And so when Moses brought this back to the people, they revered it. They placed it in an ark, in this magnificent box. This promise and these commandments were placed in an ark of the covenant that they used to lead them through the wilderness. But as we'll find out in our story tomorrow, there's much more for them to learn over those 40 years about how to be the people of God.